Hello and welcome to Maximum Deftones, the first talking book about the band. It was written and researched by Martin Harper, music is by Amanda Thompson, and it's read by Sian Jones. You can check out our full catalogue on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk, where you can also join our Maximum Collectors Club to receive special offers and free CDs. Alternatively, join the Maximum Collectors Club by filling in the registration form attached to the booklet inside this CD and post it back to us.
It's true that we did pioneer any sort of new sound that that we can continue to pioneer even further, as opposed to just being happy with what we've done so far in music and just sitting back and making the same record over and over again.
Hip-hop and metal were the two styles featured on most of the albums sold in the last half of the 1990s. Within the world of metal, the two leading lights were Korn and Limp Bizkit, and both had produced platinum-selling albums, catapulting themselves into the mainstream and suddenly making it fashionable to like the new wave of metal bands. With thousands of teenagers supporting them, these new metal bands flourished. A number of contenders to Korn's throne appeared, with the music papers announcing every week that they had found the next Korn. In the eyes of many, however, these acts were nothing but pale rip-offs. But there was one band that most felt could easily be a significant addition to the metal scene. That band was the Deftones. Based in Sacramento, the Deftones had secured a loyal and dedicated following through years of hard work. By 1999, they were on the verge of achieving their greatest success yet, a break that might lead them to becoming as popular as their contemporaries. But back in 1988, there was no Deftones, and the four individual members had no idea of what lay ahead of them. This is where our story begins.
Our biggest goal, I think, if we do have a goal, I think our goal is longevity. To get big would be good, but I think all of us, our main focus is, if I had to ask for anything, it'd be, to keep it going, for as long as possible.
The future singer of the Deftones was born Camilo Wong Marino on the 20th of June 1973. His mother, Debbie, was of mixed ancestry, combining Mexican, Chinese, Irish and Native American blood. From an early age, Camilo was known as Chinito, the Mexican word for Chinese, because his youthful features resembled those of his Oriental ancestors. Chinito was later shortened to Chino, and that has been his name ever since. His family never called him Camilo, and he is known to the world as Chino Marino, even though he always includes his real name somewhere on the Deftones album sleeves. The family came from Sacramento, California, where Chino had a stable upbringing, living in the same house until he moved out to pursue a musical career. The Marino family was a large one, with Chino being the second of 5 children and the eldest of 3 brothers. His biggest influence throughout his childhood was his mother, a local schoolteacher. Children would usually consider having your mother as your teacher as the worst thing possible, but Chino seems to have coped fairly well. The smart child, he preferred to behave in the classroom and keep any mischief away from his mother. It was Debbie Marino who first noticed Chino's musical talents. Like many mothers, she dismissed her son's banging of pots and pans as simply a desire to make noise. It soon became apparent that young Chino had an excellent sense of rhythm, easily keeping time with songs on the radio. Before long, he was also exercising his vocal cords, displaying a good sense of melody, preferring to harmonise with the backing tape rather than simply wail along with it. Despite this natural ability, Chino had little interest in developing his musical talents and, like many Californian kids, his first love was skateboarding. As Chino got older, his wild streak continued to grow. Although he was never in trouble with the law, his parents frequently told him off for his reckless behaviour. Skateboarding opened up a whole new world of possibilities. Predictably, the crowded streets of Sacramento were the ideal place for Chino and his new friends to practice their high-speed manoeuvres. Needless to say, this led to a number of confrontations with angry shopkeepers and annoyed policemen, who all suggested that the young skateboarders confine themselves to registered skate parks, well away from members of the public. This idea didn't meet with much approval, and Chino's group continued to terrorise the streets. By his early teens, Chino had become passionate about music. Surprisingly, he had little interest in heavy metal. Whilst his friends were enthusing about a new rock band called Metallica, Chino's record collection was full of albums by British new romantic bands like Culture Club and Spandau Ballet. One Halloween, he dressed up as Boy George, complete with mascara and lipstick, a far cry from his later role as leader of a 90s heavy metal band. As he grew older, Chino's tastes moved to the darker side of the British scene. And like many teenagers at the time, he began to dress in black, following the fashions of his heroes, Depeche Mode and The Cure. His favourite band at this point was The Smiths, and he grew up to love Morrissey's tales of love and rejection, the downbeat lyrics striking a chord within him. In later years, he would cite The Smiths as his greatest influence, and the Deftones would record one of their tunes, frequently playing the song live. This interest in music inevitably led to experimentation with instruments. Chino's first choice was the drums, chosen because he felt there were too many guitarists in the world already. And besides, the guitar looked a lot harder to play. Debbie Marino was pleased that Chino had decided to develop his musical ability, but she was less than enthusiastic about the presence of a drum kit in her garage. Every afternoon, Chino would return home from school and begin practicing, continuing well into the evening. He quickly progressed, soon becoming proficient. Slowly, he began to expand his music tastes, moving into harder and heavier areas. His most notable discovery was the New York group Bad Brains, who combined punk attitude with funk, jazz and reggae, turning out a heady brew of groove-laden hardcore rock. Chino was deeply impressed with their unique style, and began changing his drum style to fit Bad Brains' funky patterns. But it didn't all go according to plan. As much as he practiced, he began to feel that he would never be anything other than an average drummer. He was determined to persevere, however, and continued his practice sessions. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before Chino became disillusioned with his lack of progress and put the sticks aside. Eventually, he sold the kit and bought himself a microphone, plugging it into his stereo and singing along to his favourite records. Although this was fun, he never really considered the possibility of a career as a rock and roll singer, although his family quickly noticed just how good his voice was and encouraged him to try and take it further. Around this time, his first opportunity to join a band arose. Many of the family's relatives lived in the area, and they all kept in regular contact. One of Chino's many cousins happened to be walking across town one day when he heard music coming from a nearby garage. On closer inspection, he realised that the creator of these sounds was a 17-year-old boy. The garage had been fitted with a surprising array of musical equipment, including an expensive guitar and an equally costly amplifier. Realising that the boy had a genuine talent, Chino's cousin approached him and suggested he might like to meet Chino. The boy, whose name was Stephen Carpenter, thought it was a fine idea, and the cousin said he would send Chino round. Neither of them knew it, but the events of that sunny afternoon sowed the seeds of a very successful musical career.
The difference between a good artist and a great artist is an artist who's able to make something that's applicable to everybody intrinsically different. There's no one religion that's the right religion. There's a religion that you pick as the good religion, the one that works for you.
Stephen Carpenter was 3 years older than Chino, having been born on the 3rd of August 1970. He too had grown up in Sacramento, where his family had lived all their lives. Stephen had been an ordinary child who'd displayed little inclination towards music, preferring to skateboard and hang out with his friends. He'd purchased a cheap guitar when he was 11, but didn't devote much time to it at first, finding it hard going. Unfortunately, a pleasantly uneventful childhood was almost cut short when Stephen was 14. Walking across town one day, he was hit by a car that swerved off the road and onto the pavement. The driver was drunk and was later charged with driving under the influence of alcohol. But the damage was done. Stephen's legs were badly damaged, and he was confined to a wheelchair for several months after leaving hospital. His family sued and were awarded a large cash settlement. Although the money didn't heal Stephen faster, it did go some way to making his life a little better. Being confined to a wheelchair didn't leave Stephen with many options. Skateboarding was of course impossible, as were his other athletic pursuits. Eventually he decided that the only thing he could comfortably do was play the guitar. He no longer had to make do with his old second-hand guitar either, since he now had the money to buy himself a new one. In fact, Stephen went a little further. Within 3 months of his accident, he'd bought himself a new guitar, an expensive amplifier that was suitable for playing in large clubs, several effects pedals, and additions for his guitar, along with a 4-track recorder so he could produce his own demo tapes. All this equipment cost him several $1,000s, but the purchases weren't entirely frivolous. For a start, Stephen had significantly improved as a guitar player. Sometimes he would spend whole days in the garage playing along to his favourite albums, having taught himself. Stephen's musical tastes had originally been similar to Chino's, with a passion for Depeche Mode and Duran Duran, as well as classic rock bands like Kiss and Van Halen. Over the past year, he'd discovered heavy metal, particularly enjoying the fast and furious grind of up-and-coming thrash bands like Anthrax. In the late 80s, the Bay Area of California was famous for its growing metal scene, with Metallica and Megadeth spearheading the movement. It was these groups that Stephen was influenced by, leading him to develop a rhythm-based style that placed more emphasis on riffs and melody than extended guitar solos. Stephen's growing musical ability had brought him into contact with a number of local musicians. Foremost among these was Chi Cheng, another native of Sacramento. Chi was born on the 15th of July 1970, the son of Chinese immigrants. Like Stephen, he was a keen skateboarder, which is how the pair first met. Although they shared similar social circles, Stephen and Chi did not become friends until the accident that led Stephen to pick up his guitar again. Chi too was a musician, and had been playing the bass guitar since his early teens. His elder brother Robert had given Chi his own guitar, handing it over when he realised that his younger sibling had much more natural ability than he did. Since then, Robert has been an ardent supporter of Chi's musical career, and sometimes accompanies the Deftones on their tours. Chi's first inspiration was British metal band Iron Maiden, and they remained his primary influence, although he wasn't averse to more contemporary acts. Stephen introduced him to the new wave of American heavy metal, and it wasn't long before a musical partnership was formed. Practicing in Stephen's garage, the two friends began learning as many songs as possible, focusing on recent rock hits. Soon the limitations of just bass and guitar began to annoy them, and the pair started searching for a drummer. There are always a large number of guitarists around, but drummers are a rare breed, and they are never short of work or offers. Stephen and Chi knew of a handful of drummers in their area, but most of them were already in bands and weren't interested in joining another venture. Until they got to Abe Cunningham, that is. Abe was 3 years younger than Stephen and Chi, but he did have his own kit, and he had excellent credentials. He'd been drumming from an early age, receiving tuition from his stepfather who'd been playing for 30 years. Abe took every opportunity to practice, even joining the school marching band for a few months. He eventually gave that up because it wasn't the right style of playing. The school jazz bands were better, but they still weren't right, and Abe wanted to be a rock drummer. From the age of 7 or 8, he had watched his father play blues rock at local clubs, and he quickly realised that a life on stage was definitely something to aim for. brought up with the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix, Abe wasn't too keen on heavy metal. But he did like to play, and what Stephen and Chi were doing was a million times more interesting than school jazz bands. When they approached him and asked him to join them, Abe was more than happy to transport his kit to Stephen's garage. After taking it in turns on vocals, Stephen, Chi and Abe had decided that none of them could sing well enough. They needed to find a singer, someone who could do justice to the kind of songs they were playing. When Chino's cousin appeared in Stephen's garage, his timing couldn't have been better.
I get scared and I don't think I'm coming back up. Like if I go out there, sometimes like if the crowd will collapse and I'll be going down and I'll just like, my life will be flashing in front of my eyes. I'll be like, oh, this is it. I'm gonna get suffocated. I'm claustrophobic too, so I start ripping.
Chino's first meeting with Stephen and the band was a nervous one. He was in some of the same classes as Abe, but Chi and Stephen were 3 years older and moved in different circles. Not only that, but Chino had never sung in front of anyone outside his family before. He'd been practicing extensively for this audition, learning songs by the most popular metal bands of the day. As it happened, Stephen and his friends only had to hear one number before they were convinced. The first attempt was a Danzig song, and Chino astounded the others by mimicking singer Glenn Danzig's vocal style perfectly. If he could sing like Danzig, then he certainly had a place in the band. Then he did even better. Running through songs by Metallica and Anthrax revealed that he could also copy the deep growl and high-pitched screams of singers James Hetfield and Joey Belladonna. This was better than they could have hoped for. Heavy metal bands have a particularly punishing vocal style, but Chino could carry it off perfectly. He also managed to surprise them by breaking into a rendition of a Duran Duran song, pulling off a very passable Simon Le Bon impression. The band and their new singer began rehearsing immediately. Stephen already knew many songs and eagerly taught the others everything he knew. They even added the Duran Duran cover as a joke. As with many teenage bands, rehearsal space was a big problem. Stephen's garage was fine for his own guitar experiments, but the addition of a drum kit made it somewhat cramped. They found it impossible to play at a decent volume in such a small space and began to search for a more suitable practice space. Chino's mother offered them the family garage, which was considerably larger than the guitarist's was. This helped for a while, but it still wasn't perfect. Local village halls proved to be a better option. Although somewhat smaller than most clubs, they gave them more room to move and less sound problems. It wasn't long before they began to consider playing live. Their first shows were strictly family-only affairs, while the 4 friends built up their confidence. Chino was having no problems in this area, becoming very energetic and passionate when he had the microphone in his hand. In later years, people would comment on the difference between Chino's usually calm and casual attitude and his aggressive stage persona, something that began to manifest itself in those early rehearsal sessions. Chino's energetic performance and the band's spirited musicianship convinced their parents that the boys were serious about their new venture, and they were given as much encouragement as possible. The band's early compositions were not always as meaningful as their later work. Like most musical teenagers, they sometimes delighted in writing songs with frivolous themes. But Booty Naked, a Red Hot Chili Pepper-style ode to nakedness, was an early favourite, along with similarly silly numbers like the Vegetable Song. Another potential classic was Dope, an uninhibited tune about the joys of being stoned. Needless to say, these initial efforts didn't last too long, quickly being replaced by more mature material. The new band still didn't have a name, however. Chino spent several days thinking and came up with a single possibility: the Deftones. Later, critics would suggest that the name reflected their musical abilities, but the origins of the title are a little more positive. Def was a popular slang term in Los Angeles, and it was used in the names of record labels such as Def Jam and Def American Recordings. The tones section was something that Chino had seen on old records from the 50s. Many rockabilly and surf bands had added tone to their names, giving such titles as Dick Dale and the Deltones or the High Tones. Resurrecting the tradition, Chino simply tacked tones onto the slang term deaf and came up with the ideal name for his band. The others loved it, and it was put into use immediately. The Deftones' first gigs were low-key affairs in Sacramento's pubs and clubs, usually as the support act for more established local bands. Few of these other acts bore any similarity to the Deftones. Although heavy metal bands were becoming slowly more popular and crossover acts like Faith No More and the Red Hot Chili Peppers were attracting some attention, the majority of Californian rock bands were still following in the footsteps of Van Halen and Kiss. Melodic rock ballads and soaring choruses were the order of the day, and there wasn't much room for the Deftones' abrasive sound. Despite this, the four friends persevered. It wasn't easy to impress people who were there to hear Bon Jovi songs, but this didn't deter them. If they couldn't win over the audience, then they would make sure that no one forgot the Deftones show. Compensating for lack of commercial appeal with sheer energy and passion, they soon gained a reputation as a hard-working, no-nonsense metal band. Slowly, the Deftones began moving further afield, playing more and more shows outside the Sacramento area. This allowed them to come into contact with more like-minded bands. One that made a significant impression upon Chino was the Los Angeles thrash band Korn. The two bands were playing together at a club, with the Deftones having the opening slot. When Korn's frontman Jonathan Davis stepped on stage and began singing, Chino realised that the two bands were coming from a very similar place. They both played an aggressive riff-based style of music, with little time for the overblown soloing that was popular at the time. Drinking together after the show, Chino and Jonathan realised that they had much in common and became close friends, with the two bands touring together several times over the year. Chino has never really understood the neurotic, angst-ridden elements that Jonathan injects into Korn's music, preferring a much more positive approach. But this is purely musical difference, and it has not affected their friendship. The first 3 years for the band were very hard work indeed. Spending most of your time living out of the back of the van which you share with 3 other people is not a comfortable lifestyle. But the Deftones saw it as the price they had to pay for an increasingly successful musical career. This attitude was about to start paying off as the music industry began to take notice of this rising Californian band that were attracting a sizable following in the heavy metal community.
And the best show I had, I remember, was one night where Chino went out to the crowd. There's no one there, it's seats forever, and there's just, a couple people here and there. And he went out and we were doing one of our songs, and he sat right next to him, and he's singing them, singing to the people, and he's like, "How you doing?" You can hear it, and people are like, "What's going on?"
1994 would prove to be the best year so far for the Deftones, but it started off as business as usual. The band was booked up throughout Christmas of 1993 and well into the new year, having secured as many bookings as they could. It had become their policy to simply play as often as possible, whatever the venue. This sometimes led to them appearing in tiny low-life dives or in clubs that were dance-orientated every other night. On occasions, this could become a serious difficulty, but more often than not, the band saw it as a learning experience, and one which might prepare them for unfavourable audiences in years to come. They continued to work on their own material, frequently committing versions to tape and selling the finished mini-albums at their shows. Stephen's old home studio equipment had lasted for a few years, but it wasn't designed to produce the high-definition recordings that the band required, and they eventually traded it in for more sophisticated items. Finally, a handful of demo tapes were in circulation, each showing the Deftones at various stages of their development. The early tapes are rough and distorted and don't represent the best of the band's material. They were recorded on inferior equipment and were mostly done in one take. The tapes from the following year, however, are significantly improved, clearly showing the strength of new songs and the growing abilities of the Deftones. The personal lives of the band members were also changing. Chino was making preparations to marry his long-term girlfriend Celeste, the woman who would eventually bear his 2 sons. Celeste had become used to her boyfriend's lifestyle, and they both agreed it was better to wait until the band was going through a quiet period before finally tying the knot. Such a break was planned for the autumn of 1994, and the wedding arrangements were being made. Abe Cunningham had recently become involved with the woman he would later marry. Her name was Anna Lynn, and she later added female vocals to the Deftones' second album, Around the Fur. Stephen was the only member of the band that wasn't married by the end of the decade. Chino, Abe and Chi were all interested in starting families, as well as becoming rock stars, and both Chino and Chi would soon be fathers. The turning point for the Deftones came at a Los Angeles show in July. The band was playing in a fashionable nightclub called the Coconut Teaser. This wasn't anything special for them, and they'd played in similar clubs many times. What made this performance different was the presence of a man called Guy Ozieri, who had noticed the growing popularity of this band from Sacramento and had decided to check them out. Guy Ozieri wasn't just another member of the audience, however. He was the co-chairman of a growing record label by the name of Maverick. Maverick Records had been in and out of the news since its inception, mostly due to the fact that it was created and funded by Madonna. In the early 90s, there were many people ready to believe that the Material Girl's business ability was insufficient to successfully manage a record label. They were soon to be proved wrong, however. By 1994, Guy Ozieri was a well-known figure in the music world. At the tender age of 21, he had become one of Maverick's most important talent scouts. By the time he saw the Deftones play in Los Angeles, he had already signed Alanis Morissette, who would release the multi-platinum album Jagged Little Pill the following year. Another of his signings, Canadian alternative rockers Candlebox, would also reap great rewards in years to come. The Deftones would be his next success. After the show, Guy arranged to head backstage and meet the band. When he did so, he explained to them who he was and just how impressed he'd been with their performance that evening. Guy also suggested that they should come over to the Maverick offices the following day to discuss their plans for the future. Of course, the band agreed and said they'd be there. When Guy left, they began to seriously consider the implications of his visit. Obviously, they were about to be made an offer, but on what terms? They resolved not to let this go to their heads and not to accept the offer out of hand. Everything must be carefully thought out. As it happened, they had very little to worry about. Guy Ozieri was a fair man, and he offered them a deal based on their own desires and ambitions, one that they were very happy to accept. The Deftones were signed to Maverick Records, and from here onwards life would be very different. To begin with, the years of living a demo-to-demo existence were over. For a long time they had worked on the basis that the best thing they could do was to keep raising money for better and better demo recordings. The Deftones could now take a break and start working on their first proper album. There would be no need to try and scrape together the necessary funds, because Maverick would provide them with everything they required. The band welcomed the opportunity to take a break from touring. They had always planned to have a few weeks off, but the situation had worked out better than they could have ever imagined. Chino's wedding made the occasion a double celebration, since it seemed only fitting that he and Celeste should marry when the band was at its highest point so far. Besides, this might be the only quiet period for some time. Before long, they would have to begin work on the album, followed by extensive touring and promotional duties. There was no going back now. The future might hold nationwide tours and months on the road, but the band weren't fazed by this. Their dreams were closer now than they had ever been.
It's always weird when you're going in to do your first record and You know, you have companies behind you now. You're not only making it for yourself. It's like there's other people that are involved now, and it's a lot more pressure. So when we made it, you know, I think we were all a little bit, you know, more tense and a little bugged out when we were going to do it. But you know, once we got in, we did it, and it was cool.
The Deftones entered the recording studio in late 1994 in order to begin work on their debut album. A July 1995 release was planned, giving plenty of time to swing the promotional machine into action. A producer was needed, so Maverick came up with a list of suggestions for the band to consider. Eventually, it was decided that Terry Date would produce the Deftones' first album. A highly respected producer, Terry Date has worked with some of the rock world's most illustrious names. His previous clients included Pantera and Soundgarden, and he was the man behind White Zombie's multi-platinum album Astro Creep 2000. Now that a suitable producer had been found, the Deftones could begin work on the album itself. Several of the songs to be included were already written and perfected, since they had been playing them live for a long time. However, in an effort to record the best material that they could, they set about writing a number of new songs, ones that better reflected the current stage of their musical development. Furthermore, Terry Date had some ideas about how the band could improve the structure and arrangements of the songs. It was him who came up with the idea of using a hip-hop DJ on a couple of tracks on the album. Within 3 years, almost every metal band to emerge on the scene would bring their own DJ along. The same DJ would appear on all 3 of the Deftones albums, eventually becoming a permanent member of the band. With an experienced producer at the helm, the band were able to make the most of their material. The hard work shows. Adrenaline, as the album was called, is an incredible first effort. At the first hearing, the music seems to be a simple wall of aggressive noise. But beyond the anger and distorted guitars, the band shows an impressive grasp of melody. Chino's voice on the tracks, such as 7 Words and Litter, swings between low guttural growls and high soaring notes with a practiced ease. As many critics noted, the Deftones didn't easily fit into any existing genre. They weren't another angst-ridden rap metal outfit like Rage Against the Machine, and they didn't sound like industrial acts like Ministry or 9 Inch Nails. Certainly there were elements of industrial or rap in their songs, but the Deftones differed from the majority of their contemporaries in that they were willing to use anything that sounded good. This eclectic attitude would become more and more apparent in their music, having first appeared on Adrenaline. The track Nosebleed, for example, contrasted moments of furious energy with mellow, almost quiet interludes. A single, 7 Words, was released from the album, with an accompanying video that received a reasonable degree of airplay on MTV. Unfortunately, the single was not particularly successful, and it was quickly forgotten. Upon its release, Adrenaline attracted several favourable reviews, although there seemed to be a definite tendency to dismiss the Deftones as just another noisy metal band. Most critics felt it was a competent debut, but nothing special. Metal fans responded well to the album, but any success was mostly overshadowed by the growing fame of their friends Korn, who were becoming more and more popular with the rock press. Even so, Adrenaline managed to sell 200,000 copies by the end of the year, a respectable amount for a debut record. The release of their first major label album meant that the Deftones would now have to embark on a hectic schedule of touring and promotional appearances. Extensive tours were arranged, with the band supporting several high-profile metal acts. All-girl grunge rockers L7 took the Deftones out on a North American tour, which exposed them to the biggest audiences they had seen so far. L7 were riding high on the back of their surprise hit, Pretend We're Dead, and several reviews also pointed out the potential of the support act. Their old Californian friends Korn also managed to help the Deftones out by booking them as the support act for one leg of their debut album tour. But by far the greatest opportunity of those early tours was the chance to support Chino's childhood favourites Bad Brains. One of the most original bands to emerge from the Californian rock scene, Bad Brains had split up some years before, but had recently come together to record their comeback album, If a Monkey Had a Brain. Chino and his friends jumped at the chance to join one of their all-time favourite bands, and their shows together were a great success, allowing the Deftones to reach an audience that would not normally have listened to them. Bad Brains were an older band with a long-standing fan base, while the Deftones were primarily used to playing in front of teenagers. Aside from the joys of playing with some of their favourite bands, there were some very happy developments in the band's personal lives. Chino's first son, Christian, was born, and the band took a break so the singer could enjoy the company of his new son. Meanwhile, Chi's wife had also become pregnant and would later give birth to the bassist's first son, who would be named Gabriel. The Adrenaline tours lasted a total of 13 months, during which time the Deftones played in just about every state in America. They were, of course, entitled to a break after such hard work, but Maverick impressed upon them the importance of following up their recent touring successes. After taking their well-deserved rest, they were back in the studio preparing material for the second album. Their hard work was about to pay off.
I mean, this next record, I don't know. I mean, I like it. It's tons more than the last one. So, I mean, I don't know where it's going to go. I hope, far, but, it's like, I'm already fulfilled, you know what I'm saying?
The sessions for the Deftones' second album would be conducted differently to those for Adrenaline. For a start, there were to be no 18-hour stints, no marathon all-night sessions. The band would take things a little easier this time. In 1994, they'd been excited at the prospect of releasing an album, and had rushed through the process as quickly as possible. Having now found a sizable fan base, they were able to take a little longer over the second album. Once again, Terry Date would be the producer. The same DJ, Frank Delgado, also appeared, adding scratching and beats to 4 songs on the album. Frank was a well-known figure on the underground hip-hop scene, having collaborated with a number of stars of the genre. His alliance with the Deftones brought him his greatest recognition, increasing his standing with both the metal and the hip-hop fans. By the end of the sessions, Frank had become such a valuable companion that he was asked to join the band permanently. The Deftones' second album was called Around the Fur. Media speculation suggested the title had sexual implications, but Chino disagreed. Around the Fur referred to the side of show business that you don't see. All you see is the fur and the glamour, but the seedy side usually remains hidden. Lyrically, the album dealt with similar themes to Adrenaline. Chino's songs still reflected his anger with the world and the flaws of society. His songwriting had improved considerably, and he was well on the way towards developing a unique and individual talent. Adrenaline was a respectable debut, but Around the Fur was a better album. The Deftones' sound had progressed even further, becoming a mix of pile-driving riffs and dark ambient interludes, inspired by the British goth movement of the 80s. The band's characteristic sense of melody was still there, with tracks like My Own Summer, Shove It, managing to graft a pop sensibility onto their hard-edge sound. My Own Summer was also their first hit single, receiving heavy airplay on American radio stations. The single's success was aided by the somewhat creepy accompanying video, which featured the band playing in a series of ice floes and floating cages surrounded by swimming sharks. Aside from the initial single, the album's standout tracks included Shut Up and Drive, Far Away, and MX. The former had a hypnotic, almost trance-like quality, and was easily amongst their most mellow songs so far. MX was one of the Deftones' only songs to feature a female vocalist. Chino wanted to trade lines with a woman, presenting different perspectives. He was expressing his love of material culture and having fun, and the woman was criticising him for his callous attitude. Unfortunately, there were no female singers in the studio at that point, so Chino was forced to ask Anna Lynn, Abe Cunningham's wife, to step in and play the part. Annalyn was not keen on this idea at all and steadfastly refused, but Chino's begging won her over and she agreed to record the parts. For someone who isn't a professional singer, Annalyn made an impressive recording debut. Around the Fur was a reasonable success. By the end of 1997, it had sold approximately 400,000 copies, twice as much as its predecessor, and it showed no signs of slowing down. With the release of the Deftones' third album, sales of Around the Fur would rocket, easily hitting the platinum mark. With their fame slowly growing, the Deftones were also in demand in other areas. Their friendship with Korn resulted in Chino adding vocals to Life is Peachy from their multi-platinum album of the same name. Somewhat bizarrely, the band were also featured on a Skinny Puppy tribute and remix album. Skinny Puppy are one of the original industrial acts and a great influence on 9 Inch Nails. The presence of the Deftones on their tribute album was therefore something of a mystery, and their cover version is one of the more forgettable moments of their career. The Deftones also contributed songs to 2 soundtrack albums. They made their first movie appearance in The Crow 2: City of Angels as the band playing in the club during Day of the Dead festival, and a new song, Teething, was written for the soundtrack. Although the film was not a great success, the album had some very fine moments. Old friends Korn contributed a song, as did Filter, Bush and Iggy Pop. The Deftones track isn't their best, but it stands head and shoulders above the ill-advised and mediocre cover versions handed in by Hole and White Zombie. Less well publicised was their appearance on the Escape to LA soundtrack. Here they were in good company, with the album being split between industrial acts such as Ministry and Stabbing Westward, and 90s metal bands like Tool and White Zombie. Even in such illustrious company, the Deftones track Can't Even Breathe stands out as one of the best songs on the album. With Around the Fur selling well on both sides of the Atlantic, it was once again necessary to begin a lengthy round of touring and promotional duties. The next 2 years would see the Deftones' popularity grow beyond their wildest dreams.
But I know when I'm on stage, that's where I get to go and I can groove to music and have a good time. And I'm up there just having fun, I'm not worrying about, anything. I'm up there just being another part of me, you know what I mean?
The Deftones' next tour was termed the World Annihilation Tour. It was designed to reach all 4 corners of the globe, and the band made strict rules about how the tour would be conducted. This time around, the Deftones would be the headlining act, even if that meant turning down opportunities to play to larger audiences. They were offered the support slot with Korn, who were by now one of the most popular metal bands in the world, but they turned it down. From now on, they would play on their own terms. The World Annihilation Tour was incredibly successful. The Deftones were making headlines in all of the rock newspapers and magazines, as critics speculated about the band's future. Others were not so positive, again likening them to Korn and suggesting they were merely the first in a long line of pale rip-off bands. This kind of criticism annoyed the Deftones. Both bands had been in existence for a similar length of time, and it was simply fate that had allowed Korn to enter the spotlight before them. There were a handful of unfortunate incidents on the road, and the European leg of the tour in particular was dogged with bad luck. After a show in Germany, the band discovered that thieves had raided their tour bus and stripped everything from it. This included a couple of guitars that Stephen kept on the bus, as well as a large amount of home video footage that was due to be edited and made into a tour diary video, intended for release the following year. They were now left with just the clothes that they were wearing after the show. Worse still, all their personal belongings had also disappeared, including a number of letters from friends and family members. With the help of their management and the local police, they were able to replace most of the essential goods and get back on the road, as they were determined not to hold up the tour. A few days later, bad luck struck again. Travelling from Oslo, the capital of Norway, to Stockholm in Sweden is a 10-hour journey, and not always a safe one in the freezing cold of February. Unfortunately, the Deftones tour bus broke down in the middle of nowhere sometime after midnight. They tried to arrange replacement transport, but in the middle of the night in ferocious weather conditions, this wasn't an easy task. Eventually, another bus was sent, and the band transferred their belongings into the new vehicle. By this time, they were cold and frustrated, having been sat shivering in the old bus for several hours. Some of the incidents were less depressing, however. During a show in California, Chino launched himself into the crowd as he had done many times over the years, expecting the audience to carry him back to the safety of the stage. This is what usually happened, but not this time. Somehow, one fan managed to jam his finger into Chino's nose, causing him some fairly serious pain and provoking a nosebleed. When he made it back to the stage, Chino wiped the blood away with a towel and continued on with the song. Thankfully, there was no serious damage, and Chino thought the whole incident to be rather funny. Despite all the touring, Chino still found time to work on a solo project when the band was in America. Working with a DJ and 2 Sacramento guitarists, the project was called Team Sleep, and had very little in common with the Deftones. When discussing the work, Chino compared it to Massive Attack or Jane's Addiction in their quieter moments, rather than the raging fury of his usual band. Fans and critics alike were surprised to hear that Team Sleep were influenced by British ambient groups. But Chino was philosophical, saying that it wasn't a commercial exercise, just something he was having fun with. Chino was given an extra opportunity to work on the project when the Deftones were forced to come off the road in June, after bassist Chi Cheng injured his foot. Extensive surgery was needed to reconstruct the bones in his big toe, which had been shattered in an offstage accident. Doctors ordered him to stay off the foot for 6 weeks, so the Deftones cancelled plans for the forthcoming dates. Thankfully, this coincided with news that Abe's wife Annalyn was pregnant with their first child. The couple had the opportunity to celebrate in their hometown with the whole band present. The only time the Deftones gathered together in the studio was to prepare a song for the Depeche Mode tribute album. The album, called For the Masses, featured cover versions from a wide variety of modern artists, including Monster Magnet, God Lives Underwater and The Cure. The Deftones recorded a version of To Have and to Hold, one of Chino's favourite Depeche Mode songs.
Cover itself, just the artwork of the pony, it's sort of a symbol, I think, of our individuality in a way. It's very plain. It's just a white pony, and it's just there, and it stands on its own. And I think that's sort of how I look at our band.
Towards the end of 1998, the Deftones joined the Vans Warped Tour, an annual round-the-world trek featuring the top punk, hip-hop and alternative acts. Originally, it had been a small punk-only festival, but it had grown in popularity until it was one of the major package tours. The Deftones were one of the most popular acts on the bill, along with punk diehards Pennywise and Bad Religion. The first leg of the tour went well, after which the caravan took a break, allowing the bands to concentrate on their own tours before resuming the trek in spring. For the Deftones, this was an opportunity to tour as a support act, something that would be a very rare occurrence from now on. But this was a special occasion, for the band were to be playing with Black Sabbath, who had reunited on a permanent basis for the first time in nearly 20 years. Like most metal bands since the 70s, the Deftones were heavily influenced by the proto-metal sounds of Black Sabbath. They were very excited about the prospect of touring with their childhood heroes, especially with almost every metal band in the world competing for the privilege. Unfortunately, there was little cause for celebration. The first show in January went well with the Sabbath fans, many of whom already knew of the Deftones, responding well to the band. During the show, however, Chi Cheng began to experience pain in his left foot. By the end of Black Sabbath's set, he was in agony and was quickly taken to a doctor. The cause was found to be last year's injury. Although the surgery had been successful, the wound had recently become infected, causing Chi's foot to become sore and swollen. The necessary surgery was minor, but it would keep Chi off his feet for at least a month. The implications were serious. The Deftones would have to continue the tour without their usual bassist. Reluctantly, the band decided it was better to carry on rather than disappoint the fans. Sergio Vega, the bassist with Californian metal band Quicksand and a long-standing friend of the Deftones, was recruited to replace Chi for the duration of the Black Sabbath tour. Chi would join the others in time for the second leg of the Vans Warped Tour. After the tour, the Deftones returned to the studio to begin work on their third album. By this time, their profile had increased greatly, so media speculation about the next Deftones album was rife. Many critics suggested it would be their breakthrough album, the one that pushed them into the mainstream alongside the likes of Korn and Limp Bizkit. Unfortunately, it would be a long time before they were able to confirm their suspicions, for the album was not released for almost a year. It proved to be the longest and most painstaking session of the band's history, and one that would test the four friends to the limits of their endurance. Occasionally, word of the album's progress would leak out into the world. A source close to the band revealed that the new work would be called White Pony, and that Chino was changing his name to Pony One on the day of its release. The album was indeed called White Pony, but the name-changing suggestion was simply a joke to annoy gullible journalists. Other rumours hinted that the band would move into the same territory as Radiohead. This was simply sloppy journalism. Chino mentioned that he had recently been influenced by the sound of Paranoid Android, so it was inferred that the band would now sound like Radiohead. There was an official preview of the album in January of 2000. Stephen Carpenter shot 5 minutes of footage from the White Pony sessions, featuring snippets of songs that would appear on the forthcoming album. The promo film could be downloaded from the Deftones website, along with the titles of some of the new songs. Despite the band's best intentions, it would still be another 6 months before the album reached the shelves.
I would really, really love to do something with PJ Harvey. That's just me, though. I think they wouldn't mind, but I mean, I would love to do something. Just to sing with her would be like, that's all I mean, you know what I'm saying?
The Deftones' third album was finally released on the 20th of June 2000. It provoked immediate discussion, with the parties being divided into two camps. Those who hated the album and those who loved it. Thankfully, those who loved White Pony were in the majority. A large number of people were unimpressed with the change in the band's musical direction, even though they had clearly been heading that way since the first album. White Pony still featured bone-crunching riffs and phenomenal drumming, but they were complemented by some very un-metal moments. At times, Chino's voice began to sound like British singer Morrissey's, floating high and melodic over the razor-sharp guitars beneath. This was most evident on Street Carp, which opened with Chino's angry roar, before becoming one of the Deftones' heaviest songs. The first single, Change, in the House of Flies, was quickly picked up by MTV, who hoped it would improve on the standards set by 1997's My Own Summer, Shove It. The powerfully melodic chorus proved irresistible to the alternative radio stations, who quickly began calling White Pony the album of the year. Certainly it was the Deftones' best album so far, and it stood up respectably next to the latest efforts from contemporaries such as Korn and Pitch Shifter. The album's release was preceded by a series of live web broadcasts that saw the band performing a handful of songs from White Pony, as well as some older material. The shows lasted about 40 minutes each, and could be seen on the band's website. An estimated 10,000 people tuned in to hear the first official performance of the new songs, and they received a favourable response. Sales of the album picked up quickly, selling consistently enough to suggest that White Pony would be in the album charts for several months. Shortly afterwards, the Deftones headed out onto the road for another marathon tour. Once again, they dictated the terms. They were offered the support slot with Limp Bizkit, but they preferred to headline their own tour. The early shows were a definite success, going some way to proving that recent criticisms of the band were unfounded. With a lengthy tour ahead of them, the Deftones were given the opportunity to show the world that they deserve to be counted amongst the finest of today's metal bands. And certainly they are one of the most original. After 10 long years, they are on the brink of the worldwide success that they deserve.
Thank you for buying Maximum Deftones. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. If you did enjoy it or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, Surrey, UK, KT3 6YY, or email on mail@chromedreams.co.uk. For more details on joining the Maximum Collectors Club and claiming your free CDs, check out our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk or look at the booklet inside this CD. Thanks again for listening and goodbye for now.